So as you mentioned private equity, and there's many private equity investors in the room here today. One of the things that we hear from them, particularly as we're 10 years into an economic expansion, is I'm really focused on businesses that I feel are going to hold up better in a downturn, assuming we're ever going to have one. And traditionally, one of the areas that people have gone to, because they feel it holds up better, is food. And David, you really are one of the leaders in our food practice. Maybe you can provide a little more insight around that.
Sure, thanks, Rob. So what we're seeing in food, I would break it down into branded and unbranded. And on the branded side, the dynamics are similar to what Janki referenced just a moment ago. On the branded side, you have large CPG companies who are making acquisitions early and earlier. These CPG companies have essentially outsourced R&D and innovation to their M&A departments. And so every category in food is being disrupted by these emerging brands, and these emerging brands are being acquired by the large CPG earlier and earlier. So many of these businesses never get to 20 million of revenue. And so for a PE investor, the opportunity is more along the lines of growth equity investments, because you don't see these brands get to a scale where you can do an LBO. Some of them make it, some of them get larger, but predominantly it's a smaller investment size and a growth equity type investment. On the unbranded side, it's different. You still have the dynamics where category winners and losers are being determined by the real rate of change in social media. So the consumer's getting smarter and smarter, whether it's on the issue of sustainability or labeling or sophistication of food palettes or experimentation. The consumer is changing, the winners and losers in each category are changing, but on the unbranded food side, the businesses aren't getting acquired quite so early, so there's more LBO opportunities for the private equity investor.
We're seeing, David, some of those same dynamics playing out in Europe. Especially we see too that the food companies buying innovation. I call it the pharma model because the pharmaceuticals have been buying innovation for 20, 30 years, but food companies over the last 4 to 5 years have been doing the same. And we also see food companies buying in capability in the online channel we've all been talking about. So last year we saw Unilever buy Graze, and that was both an acquisition of a pretty small company by Unilever, one of the world's largest CPG groups, but it was also very much the acquisition of a data-driven direct-to-consumer snacking business. Now Graze started on the online-only model and had an incredibly rich data set. If you went into its facility, you could see the boards flashing in real time as products went out and they had consumer feedback coming in. And this enabled incredibly rapid innovation. And they could get products out there, but if the products worked, they could ramp them up quickly. And if the products didn't work, they were very ruthless. They could be killed in a matter of days. Also, too, we've heard earlier about behind the front end, the back end setup. So the factory, the packing operation, and the interaction with the network of delivery companies was designed ground up, and it gave great efficiency, it gave great speed and incredible flexibility. And when the FDA came to look at Graze's factory in the UK, they described it in summary as the Google of food. But it's interesting, this was an innovative company 6, 7 years ago, and it started very much in the online-only world. But it turns out that snacking is not a subscription business as something like essential personal care. So about 4 years ago, Graze went from its online-only snacking model into also traditional retail. So following the acquisition of Dollar Shave Club, which was obviously an essential personal care subscription model by Unilever, this is the second acquisition of a subscription model by Unilever. But I don't think it'll be the last by Unilever or the last by any big CPG company. I've spent years talking to the major companies. They've always wanted a way to bypass brick and mortar, and these days bypass Amazon. So I think there'll be a lot more deals by big CPG companies getting hold of many smaller businesses that have direct access to consumers and can provide that immediate reaction to how brands are forming and what consumers want.
Thanks, Alex. I actually want to add a little bit to that and maybe tie back to some of what Dom had mentioned earlier, which is this question of, is retail dying? And the answer is there's always going to be a place for brick and mortar retail, but we're seeing it evolve in a pretty big way, and particularly the brands that are going into e-commerce, going into brick and mortar rather, are often being formed in the e-commerce environment, and they often then extend into the retail space. And so as all of us know, there's this huge disruption that continues to happen where you build a new channel, which is this e-commerce channel. You have unlimited shelf space on places like Amazon, so there's no limit to the shelf space that you can put product on. And you also make it very easy and very cost-effective to deliver a targeted message to an end consumer. So what ends up happening is, you've heard this theme from all of us, is that the brand messaging is getting ever more segmented, and so therefore these brands that are smaller are having the ability to be successful at a much smaller level. And the big companies are struggling with what do you do in this environment. So there's a parallel actually with what we've seen over the last several decades in the news cycle, which is that as things moved from a broadcast environment, which was primarily driven by geography and the reach of your radio waves, and moved into a cable environment where everybody had cable in their home, what happened is the content shifted from the content focused on the local to content focused on individuals' focus and individuals' editorial bias, perhaps. And so what we've seen over those decades that happened is smaller segments of the market have been targeted by different news companies that don't necessarily try and reach the whole audience. All they're trying to do is reach a particular audience that it's interesting to. The same thing is happening in the brand space because it's disruption in e-commerce. And what's happening is it's become very easy to deliver this targeted marketing message to an individual and to a very small slice of the market, and that is disrupting the whole large brand concept. And so these large brands now are having to buy and acquire companies at a smaller level, at a smaller size, in order to figure out how to do this and to make it work.
Yeah, so Chris, completely agree with what you're saying about a more targeted message. And in addition to that, it's really companies that are listening, or that are truly listening to their end consumer. So it's clear that the end consumer currently is in the driver's seat, right? They're the ones who are pushing brands into many unique directions. And they're also going to social media and technology to really be heard, to express, what's important to them, what they're all about. I mean, they're literally telling the world what they're eating, what they're putting on their skin, what they're buying, really what they're doing overall. And so companies really need to be able to figure out how to take all of this data and feedback and parse through it and effectively find the valuable insights that they can then incorporate into their businesses. So how we're seeing this play out, at least in the beauty and personal care space, for example, is that even with all of the companies that we have presenting today in that category, they've really successfully advanced their products over time, and they've evolved their brand messaging as well to capture themes such as green, clean, natural, and also associating themselves with the social cause. So they've been listening to those consumers, and they know what matters to them, and they've now incorporated it successfully into their businesses.
Janki and Chris, let me pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. Companies that are showing real mastery of direct-to-consumer selling are really attractive to the investor community today. And if you think about it, it's Amazon that's really creating that opportunity and the opportunity to scale. And we have a number of company presenters here, Gorilla Grip, for example, that are good examples of this. These Amazon sellers are focused on brand building, just like you say, and messaging that brand. But they're going one step further and doing something really powerful. They're building a core competency in how to perfect selling on the Amazon marketplace. These Amazon sellers, 24/7, with their own employees, are curating, merchandising, marketing, improving how their digital shelf is shown, including price. So again, not Amazon employees. If I think about brick and mortar, Dom, it would be like a consumer product company putting one of their employees in every retail store location to manage the shelf.
Yeah, I mean, and what I'd say there, Brad, is there's no doubt in my mind that brick and mortar retail is a component of brand building at the end of the day. And I think we all in this room know, and I certainly embrace the fact that customer acquisition online is a very powerful tool, very scalable. It's also gotten more expensive and more difficult to do in certain categories. And so what we're seeing is a massive proliferation of new brick and mortar locations being put up by the digitally native brands. And they're doing that for a couple of reasons. One, they have incredible access to data. So they can really pinpoint where do we want to put these locations to not only serve as a location to just sell product, but to really build the brand and to do it with the customer that makes the most sense for them over the long term. So it's one component, I would argue, as not only distribution of product, but of building of brand over the long term. And I find that as a really powerful theme within brick and mortar retail.
We're involved in a skincare business in Europe, and actually brick and mortar is important for its historic business. So in its home market, it's got incredible market share. It's got distribution in mass, in pharmacy, and department stores. But I think it's fair to say this particular skincare brand has had difficulties and has spent years and time and money trying to grow similar brick and mortar distribution in other parts of the world and hasn't had great success. So last year, they scrapped all traditional brick and mortar outside their home market, and they've gone online only in Europe and China. And actually, they've had incredible success with the more specific targeting of their consumer base. They've seen much more rapid sales growth historically at much lower cost. And it's an interesting thing, we think about China. China is an enormous market, and the Chinese have a tendency to want to buy premium Western skincare brands, especially when they know that the product inside that is real and there's nothing nasty in those tubes and those bottles. But if you actually ship into China and you sell through traditional brick and mortar, you have to go through the Chinese regulatory regime, which means animal testing. And for most Western skincare brands, animal testing is an anathema. But actually, if you go as a directly imported product and you go through online channels like Tmall, legitimately you can avoid that animal testing need, so you can address the world's largest market for consumers in skincare without having to dilute your brand image by animal testing.